The sky held no warmth, just a pale lid stretched over the vast white hush, where the mountains folded into themselves like the backs of sleeping beasts. Pines stood buried to their waists in snow, black against the drifts, their branches heavy, motionless. No birds sang. Only the wind, rising and falling, brushed the land like a distant breath through the ribs of a dying world. A man moved through it, slow and deliberate, as if he were part of the landscape itself, one of the old trees that had unrooted and wandered off on its own. His coat was coarse and stained, stiff with age and cold. Furs hung across his shoulders, their edges crusted with frost. He left no trail. Snow swallowed his footprints as fast as he laid them, a rifle slung across his back, unused. He carried a small axe in one hand, a length of rope in the other. His beard was rimmed with ice, eyes sharp but quiet, watching, listening. He had come down from the northern ridges where no roads went, where only wolves and old men still believed the world had not ended. His cabin sat by a frozen creek 3 days north of here, hidden beneath a slant of rock and timber, forgotten by all but him. He hadn't spoken in weeks. The trap line ran along the ridge, old iron, buried in snow, marked by bent sticks in his own memory. He checked them one by one. A fox, 2 hares, one sprung empty. He worked in silence, kneeling slowly, his breath white against the metal. It was just past the 3rd snare that he saw the shape. At first it was just a tangle in the snow, too pale, too still. A wolf might have passed her, thinking her dead. She nearly was. She lay curled like a discarded doll, arms tucked, face turned into her sleeve. Snow had gathered on her shoulders, begun to harden in her hair. Her boots were thin. One had slipped halfway off. A smear of blood stained the snow beneath her left leg. The wind hadn't covered it yet. He stood there a long moment, unmoving. Then he knelt. Gloved fingers pressed to her throat. Waited. A faint thud. He stayed kneeling as the wind passed over them both, cold and patient. He took off his coat. The mountains watched. Pines whispered nothing. A hawk drifted far above, circling. He lifted her gently, like something already broken. The path back would take hours. He did not look back at the place she'd fallen. By nightfall, the snow would erase it entirely. Only his tracks would remain. A man burdened now, heading into the deep woods with a silent shape in his arms. And even those would vanish by morning. The wind came low through the pines, threading the needles like breath through a comb. It didn't howl, didn't cry. It whispered as if the forest itself knew something had shifted and was waiting to see if it mattered. He walked steady, his arms locked around the girl's frame, her limbs limp, head fallen against his chest. She weighed less than she should have. Her skin, where her sleeve had torn, was bluish white. The blood at her knee had dried hard and black, crusted to the hem of her dress. She did not stir. Snow creaked beneath each step. The weight of her changed his pace, made it careful. There were slopes here he'd crossed 100 times, half asleep. Now he watched each one as though it might break beneath him. He kept off the old beaver trail, where the ice sometimes cracked under pressure. He knew the weak spots, where the land slumped under hidden streams, where snow could turn to air and pull a body down like breath into lungs. A raven followed them. Sometimes it flew ahead and waited, black against the drifted white. Then it would rise again and circle back, slow and deliberate, as if puzzled by the burden in the trapper's arms. He didn't speak to it. Around midday, they reached the gully where the fallen cedar still bridged the narrow ravine. He crossed it slow, boots muffled on the bark, the girl's breath shallow against him, almost too soft to feel. She coughed once, a dry, broken thing. He paused, one hand on the tree trunk to steady himself. She didn't cough again. He moved on. By late afternoon, the wind thickened. Flakes came down now. Fat, heavy ones, slow like ash. The sky darkened not from cloud, but from the settling hush of early evening, when the sun fades behind the ridge and the whole world goes pale and blue. Then through the trees, the cabin. It sat low, crouched beneath a lean of rock and firs as though hiding. Smoke did not rise. He'd left it cold. But the walls still held. The roof was half mended, patched with hides and old tar. A broken sled leaned near the doorway, covered in frost. He kicked the door with his heel. It groaned inward, old hinges stiff. Inside it smelled of pine pitch, animal hide, dust. He laid her on the cot by the wall, where the furs were thickest. She didn't wake. Her lips were cracked. Her hand twitched once as he covered her with a blanket. He lit the fire from memory. Dried moss, slivers of cedar, flint. The flames came slow, like they too remembered silence. He fed them carefully. When the heat finally reached the edges of the room, it touched her face, brought back the color like a sun passing behind clouds. He stripped off his outer layer, hung it to dry, took the kettle, filled it with snow from outside, set it to melt. Then he sat. In the dark corner, beyond the fire's light, he sat on a wooden stool and watched the flames move across her skin. Her breath grew longer now. Her chest lifted, fell. He didn't ask where she had come from, didn't wonder aloud who had left her. The mountains didn't speak, and neither did he. The only sound was the fire cracking low, the kettle beginning to hiss, and somewhere far off, the raven calling once into the blue dark. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember how stillness used to feel before it came carrying someone else's fate. Night came down like a slow breath, folding the cabin into darkness. The wind had died. Even the trees were still, branches held like frozen gestures in the cold. Snow fell softly, without weight, blanketing the roof and muting the world beyond the door. Inside, the fire pulsed. Not bright, it gave off more warmth than light. Shadows moved across the walls, the low arc of the chimney stones, the rough boards patched with bark and cloth, the outline of antlers nailed above the window like a warning or a memory. The girl hadn't moved. She lay beneath 3 layers of fur and wool. Her boots had been pulled off, her foot wrapped in dry cloth. The bandage at her leg was clean now, though the wound beneath had turned a sick color he didn't like. He'd rubbed her arms once to bring blood back. Her skin had been cold as wet stone. It still was, in places. He sat by the stove, one boot off, one glove still on. His hands, reddened by snow, cradled a tin cup of broth he hadn't tasted yet. Steam rose, then vanished. His rifle leaned in the corner, forgotten. Outside, the woods creaked once. Some branch under the weight of ice, then fell silent again. He watched her from time to time, not out of suspicion, but something slower. Wariness shaped like memory. She looked younger in the firelight. Her hair had dried into waves that clung to her cheeks. Her hands were small, marked with scratches. Her dress, if it could be called that, was thin enough to show the outline of her ribs when she breathed. A piece of leather had been sewn into her sleeve, as if to patch a tear. Not her stitching, he guessed. Too neat. Someone else had kept her warm once. Whoever they were, they hadn't followed her here. The trapper rose and poured what was left of the kettle into a bowl. He dipped a cloth, wrung it out, returned to the cot. Kneeling, he pressed it to her neck, her wrists, her forehead. She stirred once, brow twitching. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her breath smelled like cold iron. He didn't try to wake her. Instead, he sat again. This time not by the fire, but on the edge of the room where the warmth barely reached. He leaned against the log wall, felt the chill of it bleed through his shirt. And slowly, thought returned. Not words, not names, just flashes. A red coat half buried in snow. A pair of boot prints that ended at a river. A wooden cross burned at the edges. The sound of glass breaking at night, followed by a child's cry. And then silence, always silence. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the fire had settled into coals. The girl was still breathing, slow, faint. Outside, the first wolf called from somewhere past the ridge. Not close, not far, just enough to remind the dark that it was never empty. He stood, laid another log on the embers, watched them rise into flame again. She would live, maybe, but nothing that fragile crossed his threshold without leaving something behind. Chapter 3, Smoke and Shadow. Night came down like a slow breath, folding the cabin into darkness. The wind had died. Even the trees were still, branches held like frozen gestures in the cold. Snow fell softly without weight, blanketing the roof and muting the world beyond the door. Inside, the fire pulsed. Not bright, it gave off more warmth than light. Shadows moved across the walls, the low arc of the chimney stones, the rough boards patched with bark and cloth, the outline of antlers nailed above the window like a warning or a memory. The girl hadn't moved. She lay beneath 3 layers of fur and wool. Her boots had been pulled off, her foot wrapped in dry cloth. The bandage at her leg was clean now, though the wound beneath had turned a sick color he didn't like. He'd rubbed her arms once to bring blood back. Her skin had been cold as wet stone. It still was, in places. He sat by the stove. One boot off, one glove still on. His hands, reddened by snow, cradled a tin cup of broth he hadn't tasted yet. Steam rose, then vanished. His rifle leaned in the corner, forgotten. Outside, the woods creaked once. Some branch under the weight of ice, then fell silent again. He watched her from time to time, not out of suspicion, but something slower. Wariness shaped like memory. She looked younger in the firelight. Her hair had dried into waves that clung to her cheeks. Her hands were small, marked with scratches. Her dress, if it could be called that, was thin enough to show the outline of her ribs when she breathed. A piece of leather had been sewn into her sleeve, as if to patch a tear. Not her stitching, he guessed. Too neat. Someone else had kept her warm once. Whoever they were, they hadn't followed her here. The trapper rose and poured what was left of the kettle into a bowl. He dipped a cloth, wrung it out, returned to the cot. Kneeling, he pressed it to her neck, her wrists, her forehead. She stirred once, brow twitching, her lips parted, but no sound came. Her breath smelled like cold iron. He didn't try to wake her. Instead, he sat again, this time not by the fire, but on the edge of the room where the warmth barely reached. He leaned against the log wall, felt the chill of it bleed through his shirt, and slowly thought returned. Not words, not names, just flashes. A red coat half buried in snow. A pair of boot prints that ended at a river. A wooden cross burned at the edges. The sound of glass breaking at night, followed by a child's cry. And then silence. Always silence. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the fire had settled into coals. The girl was still breathing. Slow, faint. Outside, the first wolf called from somewhere past the ridge. Not close, not far. Just enough to remind the dark that it was never empty. He stood, laid another log on the embers, watched them rise into flame again. She would live, maybe, but nothing that fragile crossed his threshold without leaving something behind. By morning, the world had vanished. Snow pressed against the windows like a pale tide. It had risen through the night, creeping up the door, covering the porch, softening the shape of the trees until they looked like ghosts of themselves. The sky above was silver, without sun, without movement, a hollow bowl turned upside down. The trapper stepped outside. He stood for a long time under the lean-to, wrapped in his oilskin, the axe slung through a loop at his hip. His breath hung in the air and drifted, then faded. The snow reached his calves, soft but thick. When he stepped forward, it held his weight only briefly before collapsing with a muffled crunch. No new animal tracks, no sign of deer. The snare lines would be buried. He moved slowly, shoveling a path from the door to the woodpile. He worked without haste, but with purpose. The silence around him was whole. No birds, no wind, only the brush of snow against fabric and the soft thud of split logs dropped into the stack. Inside, the girl hadn't woken. He had checked her again before stepping out. Her leg was still fevered, but her skin had lost its death-gray tone. She lay still, turned slightly to the wall now, one hand curled beneath her jaw. She had made a sound in the night. Not words, not quite, but a sharp breath that came like something remembered in a dream. He hadn't gone to her then, only listened and waited. She did not cry out again. Now back inside, he set the logs by the stove and stripped off the snow-crusted coat. The fire was still burning, low but steady. He fed it. The warmth returned slowly, curling upward into the beams, softening the frost that had crept along the window glass. He boiled more snow, cut dried meat, ground a pinch of salt with the back of a spoon and added it to the pot. Then he sat. The room held stillness, like a chapel, if there had ever been such things in these woods. Dust motes moved through the light. On the far wall hung a tin plate, bent at the edge. A cracked mirror beside it showed only his shoulder and part of his face, as if the rest had chosen not to return. The girl shifted under the blanket. Her foot moved. A twitch, barely there. He watched. She didn't wake, but she wasn't gone either. That was enough for now. After a time he rose, crossed to the far wall, and lifted a small wooden box from beneath a rafter. It was old, hinges rusted, corners soft from years of damp. Inside, papers, a pocket knife, a child's drawing, faded nearly blank. And at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth, a silver brooch, tarnished, still faintly shaped like a flower. He held it a moment in his palm, not with sentiment, just long enough to remember who it hadn't belonged to. Then he closed the lid again and put it back where it had been. He didn't know her name. He hadn't asked the woods, and they hadn't offered it. But already the house had changed. Not loudly, not obviously, but in the way the warmth lingered longer, the way the kettle didn't rattle from drafts, the way he didn't check the rifle first thing in the morning. Snow still fell, but the silence had started to listen. The wind shifted on the third day. Not by much, just a subtle change in the way it touched the walls, like fingers no longer pressing, but brushing, pausing, uncertain. The cold remained, dry and thin, but the sky had paled to a softer hue. Snow still hung from the branches, but some had started to sag. A melt, not yet here, was thinking of coming. He noticed it when he stepped outside at dawn. The icicles beneath the eaves had narrowed. The birds were still gone, but the stillness had texture now, like breath held before speech. When he returned, she was awake. She hadn't moved much, just her eyes, open, following the light across the ceiling. He saw them first from the doorway, half hidden beneath the fur. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just watched. He crossed the room in silence. She didn't speak. He didn't expect her to. Her mouth was too dry, her throat too raw for that. But her eyes held to him, not fearful, not grateful, just fixed. The way animals watch fire, not understanding, but drawn to its danger. He knelt by the stove, added wood. The flames caught quickly now, fed by dry pine. When he stood again, her gaze followed, slow but steady. There was something in it that didn't ask for anything. Not help, not kindness, only recognition. As if somewhere beneath the layers of snow and skin, she already knew something he hadn't named yet. He set a tin bowl on the table. Brother thin, but hot. He let it cool, then knelt beside her, lifting her just enough to bring the spoon to her lips. She drank, barely, half spilled it down her chin. But she drank. When she slept again, it was lighter. Not the heavy stillness of near death, but the loose, half-waking rest of someone beginning to come back. He sat nearby, sharpening his knife on a stone. Not for the edge. The blade was already keen. It was the rhythm he needed. The pull, the scrape, the pause. Something old and known. At dusk, the sun touched the ridge for the first time in days. Only for a minute. But it was enough to send a ribbon of gold across the snow outside, catching in the ice on the trees. The light came through the window in a slow, glowing line. It fell across her face. Her eyes opened again. And this time, she looked not at the light, but at him. He met her gaze and did not look away. Not because he needed answers, but because something in him, long buried, long frozen, had felt the shift of weather and wanted to see what the thaw might bring. By the sixth day, she stood. Not for long, only to cross from the cot to the stove, wrapped in fur too big for her frame. Her steps were unsure, stiff with healing, but she made them without asking, without looking back. He let her move. Some things needed to be done alone. The cabin seemed smaller with her on her feet. Not in size, it was still 4 walls, 12 paces long, but in weight. Her movement changed the air. The silence pressed less. She didn't speak. He hadn't either, but they understood the rules. He chopped wood while she drank broth. She sat near the fire while he cleaned traps, his hands steady, her breath shallow but growing stronger. When she tired, she curled in the chair beside the window, Her eyes always found the trees. Not the sky, the trees. That morning he followed her gaze. Snow had crusted overnight. The sun made the surface hard, glazed in pale gold. Across the slope below the ridge, no animals moved. But something was wrong in the pattern. The snow was broken in one place. A sag where a shape had passed. Too far for prints, too careful to be a deer. He watched a long time. No movement came, but it wasn't the first time he'd felt it. A stillness too deliberate, as if the woods were holding their breath. Back inside, he stirred the coals and lit a lantern. Not for need, just to see what the light would touch. She stood again later, slower now, walked to the shelf where he kept tools, touched the edge of a worn tin cup, ran a finger along a nail that held nothing, then turned and looked at him. Her eyes weren't curious. They were cautious, measuring. He nodded once. That was enough. Later, while she slept, he went outside. Not far, just to the edge of the tree line where the path split west and down. He stood with his rifle slung, boots deep in snow, the shadows around him long and violet in the early dark. He didn't light a fire that night. Instead, he watched the slope where the snow had sagged. And in the hour before dawn, something moved there again. No sound, just a shape, pausing, waiting, then gone. He did not wake her, but he bolted the door, checked the window latches, set a trap near the woodpile, quiet as breath. When he lay down, he kept the rifle near his hand, because some things come through snow not to be found, but to remember where you live. The days grew longer, but the cold deepened. Snow no longer fell soft. It came sharp now, wind-driven and dry, a scouring powder that whistled through chinks in the cabin wall. The woods groaned under the weight of it, limbs cracked without warning. Frost found its way into the seams of boots, into the folds of coats, into the lungs. Inside, the cabin stayed warm, but not untouched. The girl spoke once, just a word, hoarse, shapeless, in the dark before morning. It was not a name, not a cry. He heard it and did not answer. But it stayed with him. It wasn't the sound of remembering. It was the sound of something breaking loose. She walked more now, slowly with a limp. Her bandages were changed each day, soaked in a bitter-smelling brew he made from roots and bark. She didn't flinch from the sting. She didn't speak again either. One afternoon, she opened the small wooden drawer by the window. Inside were flints, fishing line, a brass button with no match. She lifted the button and turned it in her hand for a long time, then closed the drawer without a word. He noticed, but said nothing. The prince had returned, always at night, always just beyond the trees. Someone walking, not running, not stumbling. Careful steps, light, deliberate, a hunter's pace. He'd seen them again that morning before she woke, crossed through the far trap line, passed over one of his old trails, the ones no one else should have known. The man who ruined his life had walked just like that. Low to the ground, slow, certain. He'd known how to move through trees like breath through lungs, had taught it to others too. Men with no past, only appetites. It was their boots that had burned the place, their hands that had held him down. But it was that man who had given the nod. He stared into the fire that night, trying to remember the man's face. But all he saw were hands, pale, clean, and smiling, while they broke what they never meant to keep. The girl sat across from him. She was watching the same fire, but her gaze was different, not afraid, not distant, tight, like something inside her had turned and was starting to look back. That night the wind stopped. The cold stayed, but the silence became sudden, unnatural. The kind that feels like it's waiting for someone to make the first mistake. He stood at the window for a long time, listening, not for footsteps, for breathing, because some things you don't hear until they're close enough to take your name. The thaw had not come, but the snow began to settle, not melt, just lower itself, as if tired. It no longer clung to branches but sagged from them, bowed trunks into crooked shapes, snapped limbs like twigs. The drifts around the cabin lost their sharp edges. They slumped, softened, grew heavy with silence. So did he. The girl had begun to look at the trees differently, Not just as cover, not just as danger, but with a kind of memory. Not full, not whole, just flashes. A narrowing of her eyes at a certain sound, a pause at a smell of oil and iron. Once he found her touching the doorframe with her fingertips, slow and deliberate, as if counting how many times someone had passed through it. She pulled her hand away when she saw him watching. He said nothing, but he felt it now, the tightening of the loop. The cabin was a circle. The fire, the stove, the cot, the window. His steps repeated the same routes. Her eyes followed them. The prince had come closer. Last night he found one in the drift behind the outhouse. Not fresh, a day old maybe, but clean, clear, deep, too deep for an animal, too wide for hers. He sat by the fire and sharpened his skinning knife, though the blade didn't need it. The rasping sound filled the space where questions wanted to live. He remembered the last fire he'd seen in those woods. Not his own. Theirs. The men had come late, after dusk. No warnings. No torches in the dark. Just sudden heat and the smell of pitch. He remembered the roof giving in with a long sigh. He remembered the smoke before the screams. He didn't remember how long he crawled through snow after. Only the weight of what he carried, and the way the snow turned black in places it shouldn't have. That fire had taken everything but his hands. And now, years later, he found himself building fires again. Small, clean ones. For warmth. For her. The girl stirred in her sleep, her face tense. No sound, just a twitch of her jaw, the flicker of fingers under the blanket. Dreaming or remembering. Outside, something shifted. Snow sliding from a slope. Or footsteps. He rose and stepped to the door. Waited. Nothing. But the quiet had a shape to it. A body. A breath. A presence that didn't want to be seen, only known. He pressed his palm to the doorframe. Same as she had done. Same wood. Same ghosts. Same men maybe, coming back around in different boots. And in the corner of the cabin, wrapped in too many blankets, the daughter of the man who had done it all slept without knowing whose house she had come to. But soon someone would tell her. If not the snow, then the gun. He smelled it before he saw it. Thin, distant, bitter. The kind of smoke that doesn't rise from a hearth but from wet branches lit in a hurry, left to smolder. It drifted from beyond the ridge, somewhere east of the trap line. Not close, not far enough. He didn't wake her. She was sitting now most mornings, wrapped in a coat too large, her knees drawn up, eyes half closed but never quite asleep. She didn't speak, didn't ask, but she knew. She felt the shift in the air. The cabin was no longer still. It had begun to listen. He took the rifle and crossed the yard. Slow, careful. Snow crunched underfoot in dry bursts. He avoided the trail, cutting through the alder and spruce, his breath low, face wrapped against the wind. It took nearly an hour to reach the rise. There, in the hollow near a fallen pine, he found it. Ashes, still warm. A campfire stamped out, shallow and nervous. No stones, no coals. Just black streaks in the snow, in a strip of canvas left behind, torn at the corner. He crouched, running a hand over the tracks. There were 3 sets, one light, one limping, one wide and straight, deliberate like a man who didn't need to rush. Boots, not moccasins. Leather worn thin at the heel. Government issue maybe, or union surplus. The kind given to men not asked too many questions. They hadn't stayed long. No food, no mess. Hunters don't clean up like that. But men who want to find something or someone do. He stood for a long time, watching the trees. It was the first time in many years he'd felt hunted. Not watched, not tracked. Hunted. When he returned, dusk was thick between the trunks. The girl had lit the lamp. She'd moved a chair to the center of the room, her back to the stove, her face to the door. Not waiting, defending. She had taken his old revolver and placed it in her lap. Her fingers rested on it, gentle, like holding something broken. He looked at her, and she looked back. Nothing said, nothing needed. She knew what smoke meant. She knew someone was coming. She didn't ask who. She didn't ask why. She already carried the answer somewhere in her ribs, like a bone never set right. He bolted the door, checked the shutters, set the rifle down by his bed. That night, neither of them slept. They just waited in the dark together, with the weight of things neither one had told the other, but both already knew. At dawn, the frost was heavy enough to bend the wire traps. The air had no warmth, no motion. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. The world stood still, like it was waiting for someone else to speak first. He rose before light and stepped outside. No prints, no sound, just that peculiar stillness again, the kind that lives between sight and sense. He scanned the ridge, the slope, the edge of the trees, and then he saw him, a man standing at the tree line, not walking, not hiding, just there, far enough to seem small, close enough to be certain. He wore a coat too clean for a trapper, no pack, no rifle visible, just stillness, like he'd been there all night or longer. The trapper didn't move. The man didn't wave. They stared at each other across the white. Two figures rooted in two lives, both shaped by loss, both holding something sharp behind the ribs. Then the man turned and walked back into the trees. No hurry, just gone. He waited an hour before moving, walked to where the man had stood. No fire, no gear, no tracks, though the snow should have held them. Only a long, narrow scuff in the frost, like something dragged or something buried. He touched the bark of the nearest pine, fresh chip marks, knife work, symbols maybe, or just anger. Back at the cabin, she hadn't moved, but her eyes followed him when he entered. He hung the coat, cleaned the rifle, and poured water into the pan without looking at her. She didn't ask. She didn't need to, because whoever that man was, she'd known someone like him, maybe once, maybe always. Later that day, she pulled the revolver apart, cleaned it with oil and cloth, and reassembled it with a steadiness that didn't belong to a girl her age. He watched from across the room. Something in him tightened. Not fear, recognition. She wasn't just someone's daughter. She was made from someone like that. That night, as the wind returned, dry, high, restless, he lit the fire low and placed the rifle where it could be reached with one breath and half a thought. Because whoever had come to the tree line hadn't come to look. They'd come to wait, and next time, they might come closer. The ridge hadn't changed. Same trees, same cuts in the stone, same narrow draw where the wind always shifted just before nightfall. He hadn't walked this way in years, not since the fire, not since the bones, but now the snow bore weight behind him, her weight. He'd told her nothing, but she'd followed anyway, quiet as a second shadow. She didn't ask why they were going, didn't ask what he carried under his coat. At the edge of the ravine, he paused. Below, the creek ran silent under a skin of ice. Long, black seams cracked across its surface. Thin as veins, sharp as broken glass. The trees here were tall and brittle, half dead from an old burn. His old burn. He remembered crawling through this very cut, snow in his mouth, hands blistered, one eye nearly shut from the smoke. He'd left someone behind that day. Not a woman, not a child, a part of himself, the part that waited for justice, for apology. It had died here, frozen under the ash. He stepped down into the hollow. The girl followed. No words, just boots and snow, breath in the cold, the long hush of trees remembering things out loud. Near the bottom, he found the place. A blackened post still stood. Nothing else. Not a roof, not a wall, just a half circle of scorched ground under the snow, like a brand the earth never let heal. He knelt there, brushed the snow aside. Beneath it, dark wood, charred, splintered. He touched it, and for a moment his shoulders lowered. Not from peace, from weight. Behind him, the girl was still, but something had shifted in her too. She walked slowly to a stump, sat, and began drawing lines in the frost with her boot. Straight lines, then a curve, then a cross through the middle. He recognized the shape. It was the mark her father had carved on everything he owned, on cattle, on crates, on men. He stood and stepped back. She kept drawing, Not fast, not angry, just slow, as if remembering something she hadn't wanted to keep, but couldn't throw out. He turned and walked, didn't speak, didn't look back, because whatever was behind them in the trees wasn't just a man. It was a story trying to catch up, a name that had broken too many things to stay buried, and now it had found its way back through her hands, through the lines she drew, through the silence they shared. By the time they reached the ridge again, the sun had dropped behind the peaks, and the first crows had begun to gather. That morning the wind didn't rise. It stayed low, hugging the earth like something wounded. The sky was pale, without depth, the color of old paper left too long in the cold. He stepped outside and the silence felt wrong, not heavy, hollow. The snow in the yard was clean, except for one thing. A single line of prints led up the path, not from the woods, from the side, from the blind spot where the old fence had rotted through, where no one came. The prints stopped 10 feet from the door. They didn't circle. They didn't back away. They just ended. At the edge of the porch, something hung from the post. A strip of hide, twisted, cut in a clean spiral, tied with wire, not left in panic, left with intent, left with memory. He took it down without a word. She stood inside, watching from the window, her face still, mouth set, eyes not afraid. Not anymore. Something colder. He laid the strip on the table, ran a hand along the leather. It was old, dried, weather-scored. But near the base, where the spiral began, was a shape burned into it, a half circle with two short lines beneath. The old cattle brand. Her father's. He stared at it until the light changed. Then he stood and walked to the stove, fed in wood, and let the fire take it. The leather curled, smoked, hissed, then darkened and broke apart. She didn't speak, but she moved the rifle closer to the door. That night they didn't light the lantern. They sat in the dark, listening. There were no footsteps, no voice, just the faint rustle of snow sliding from the roof and the wind finally rising. Slow, dry, scraping against the cabin like a whisper from far off. He slept with the rifle across his chest. She slept with her back to the wall, eyes open. And in the woods beyond the cabin, a man waited. Not hunting, not rushing, just waiting. The way fire waits under ash. The sun rose without color, only a dull smear behind the trees, like light remembered, not born. He walked the perimeter before she woke, each step slow, deliberate, rifle low, shoulders squared, not from fear, from resolve. There were no new tracks, but the feeling hadn't lifted. Something watched, not eyes, not a man. Something older. The kind of watching that came from the land itself, as if the earth remembered the shape of a wound and waited to see it torn open again. He followed the ridge west, past the snares, past the stump where the hawk nested last spring. Further than usual, his traps were untouched. His lines sagged. No animals were moving. Half a mile out, he stopped. There, carved into the side of a birch, was the same brand, the half circle. But this time, beneath it, a single word. Yours, cut deep, not just a message, a claim. He stood in the snow for a long while, watching the trees. No wind, no. When he returned, she was sitting on the steps, coat drawn tight, revolver in her lap. The snow around her was untouched, but the stillness had changed. She looked up when he approached, not startled, expecting. He said nothing. She didn't move. He opened the door and stood aside, letting her in first. She stepped across the threshold like she understood something had shifted. Like the cabin wasn't theirs anymore, just a place between two ends of a road. Inside, he lit the lamp, then stopped halfway through turning the wick. The light hit her face. Not fear, recognition. She'd seen the carving before, or worse, she understood what came after it. He placed the rifle on the table and began packing quietly. Only what mattered. A small satchel of shells, dried meat, a coil of cord. She didn't ask. She folded 2 blankets, took the second revolver from under the floorboard and checked its weight. No words, just the sound of cloth folding, metal clicking, fire breathing low behind them. That night the moon rose pale and hard, like a watchful face pressed against the glass. And far out in the trees, behind the ridge where the first cabin burned, a figure moved with purpose. Slow, certain, not approaching, circling, as if deciding whether to take back what was once his or watch it choose him first. They left before first light, not fleeing, not chasing, just moving, as if the stillness behind them had thickened into something they couldn't breathe anymore. He led, she followed. No trail, no words. The snow was deep, but the wind had quieted, leaving only their prints, a slow, two-beat rhythm cutting across the white. By midday, they reached the ridge where the land fell away into a basin of trees, dark with pine and shadow. He stopped at the edge, looked down, studied it like a map he'd once buried and forgotten. Somewhere down there was the man, not a guess, a fact. The stillness in the pines was not natural. The quiet was not empty. She came to stand beside him, didn't speak, didn't need to, because the cold between them wasn't weather, it was history, rising from the ground, heavy with ash and iron. He pointed with his chin toward a break in the trees, a place where a cabin had once stood before fire turned it into smoke and ruin. She stared. Her face didn't change, but her hands pulled the coat tighter around her ribs, as if memory had suddenly found a way in. They moved again, down the slope, through deadfall, past an old salt lick grown over with lichen. He stopped once to kneel and brush the snow from a rock. Beneath it, a spent casing, brass, blackened, left years ago, still warm somehow. They made camp near dusk, in a hollow of stone and wind shelter pine. No fire, just a blanket, some jerky between them, and a low place to breathe. She laid her head on her pack, gun beside her, eyes fixed on the sky. He didn't sleep. He sat with the rifle across his lap, watching the dark thicken, watching the shadows move too smoothly across the trees, watching for his shape to peel itself loose from the black and step forward. Once, near midnight, a twig snapped, then silence again, but different, not empty. Listening. He didn't raise the rifle, just shifted his weight and waited. She hadn't moved, but her hand was now on the grip of the revolver, thumb resting lightly on the hammer, like she'd been born for it. Somewhere out there, not far now, the man who had written both their lives in smoke was drawing near, and the night, deep and wide as the basin, had opened its mouth to let him through. The morning came in pieces. First the light, thin and colorless, breaking through the trees. Then the wind, soft, cautious, moving the tops of the pines but not touching the ground. Then the crows, circling above the basin, like they'd been waiting for a sign that didn't come. They moved quietly as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. She walked ahead now, steadier, no hesitation in her step, no fear in her shoulders. He watched her back, her hair stiff with frost, the rifle slung low. Not a girl anymore. Down in the hollow near the black stump that marked where the cabin once stood, something new waited. A man, alone, not armed, not hiding, just standing, as if he'd been there all night, as if he'd known they would come. She stopped 10 paces away. He didn't stop at all. He walked until there was only 5 feet between them. Her and the man who had carved the world wrong. And he stood there, the rifle low but not raised, because the decision had already been made. By her. She didn't shout, didn't cry, just looked at the man who had given her life and taken so many others. Then she set the revolver at her feet and turned her back. Walked past him, back toward the trees. The man stood still, a shape in the snow, smaller than she remembered. No threat left, no fire. He raised his eyes, saw the trapper now, behind her. The man who'd once burned in this very place, who had crawled out of it with blood in his teeth and a name carved behind his ribs like a blade. Their eyes met, not long, but enough. And then the trapper lowered his gaze, took her hand as she passed, and they walked, left the man standing, left the stump, the ash, the name. The past didn't follow, only the sound of snow falling from the branches. Quiet, slow, final. By the time they reached the ridge, The sun had found its way through the clouds. It didn't warm them, but it lit the way forward. And behind them, the basin closed in around what was left, what deserved to stay buried.